I don't usually speak from a text, but if I don't, I will take far too long. I feel a little bit out of place in this panel because, as I said in asking a question earlier, I'm not really a participatory researcher, although I like to think that quite a lot of the ideas that came into Robert's work actually emerged in part from work we did together 40 years ago, with Barbara as well, on the Cambridge project on agrarian change in South India and Sri Lanka. And I think I'm in grave danger of labeling myself as one of the learned in the story that you were talking about, Robert, or rather more sort of perhaps slightly, I rather like the intellectually constipated as well. So I speak as somebody who's intellectually constipated because I want to really address the second of the questions which was set for this panel, which is, have we forgotten the value of older methods with the participatory methods revolution, and then the next one about potentials for blending methods. And in part, I'm also going to knock against something that I remember from some of my very earliest conversations with Robert, which had to do with his aversion to what he spoke of as survey slavery. And I want actually to, in a way, sort of make the case for the continuing importance of a certain amount of survey research. In the 1990s, in what was then the Development Studies Institute at the LSE, we often started the series of Friday lectures given by outside speakers with a presentation by a leading practitioner scholar who'd once written a paper on the irrelevance of development studies, which is why we used to like to start the term and the year with this particular speaker. On one occasion, I recall the speaker, in advocating the virtues of participatory approaches, used the analogy of a man in the swamp. The man in the swamp knows best his own environment. It was an unfortunate analogy because, of course, it opened up the immediate response from Teddy Brett to the effect that maybe a woman in a helicopter might see much better than the man how to get out of the swamp. It's a silly story, perhaps, but it points to one of the reasons why some of us, I think, do have reservations about the kind of elevation of participatory approaches to research in some circumstances. Now I lost my screen, so oh, that's fine. Sorry about this, but really I will only get through if I oh, it's all jammed up. Okay, well, I'll have to go on using my own sweet voice. What the hell? Thomas, I can't remember the most important thing I wanted to say. So I really will have to... Absolutely terrible being a victim of this sort of technology, isn't it? Anyway, there are other reasons for urging caution are those that were brought up by David Moss years ago, drawing on his own experience with participatory methods in work in India when, as he explained, it was partly his work I was thinking of this morning when I raised that question earlier. He found these methods could be as much open to gender bias as others, and also open up arenas in which the relatively powerful were able to pursue their interests. Further, I find that for all the advances made through participatory research on poverty, it has sometimes tended to reproduce what I think of as the failings of measurement research in confusing causes and outcomes, and in focusing on the characteristics of the poor, neglecting the relationships and the structures that produce and reproduce poverty. So I really want to make a pitch, if you will, for the continuing importance of more conventional research methods, including survey research, of which Robert has long been so skeptical, as well as ethnography, structured and semi-structured interviews, and such old-fashioned approaches as that of village studies, perhaps especially when studies of the same village are carried on systematically over time. Then important trends of change in the sex ratio, for instance, or in the changing significance of land as the basis of rural power may become evident as I think they would not from participatory research approaches alone. It's an obvious point, perhaps, to say that there are great advantages in combining research methods, as was argued strongly from both sides in the conversations between economists and anthropologists that Pranab Bardhan organized a quarter of a century ago. But it's remarkable, I think, how rarely this has been done at all systematically. A great example of the effectiveness of research that combines ethnography and surveys is actually in an IDS PhD that I've had the pleasure of reading this week. The work, which ends up cracking common sense knowledge about rural politics in Pakistan, Punjab, starts with historically situated ethnography in one village. It proceeds using both ethnography and survey methods to compare villages with different characteristics, drawing on another 5 village case studies. And it finally tests hypotheses deriving from the comparison of the case studies, using mainly survey data from a much larger set of villages. The analysis combines thick ethnographic description and some quantitative modelling. I really wish that there was more research that combined methods in this way. It's such an obvious sort of point to make, but I beg to be contradicted, but for me it remains surprising how little of such research has been done. The last point that I want to make, and this in part came out of reflecting upon the work that Robert and I did all those years ago coming out of the Cambridge project, when we set about trying to compare the 12 villages that had been surveyed in that project. And it is really to wonder at the potentials of qualitative case analysis, of QCA, which aims to advance beyond the limitations of a single or of a small number of case studies and to address too the limitations of large-end statistical analyses by taking systematic account of moderate-sized samples. I think, in a way, our exercise in comparing the villages in our project was a rather sort of elementary exercise in QCA, though we certainly didn't get into Boolean analysis, as I recall. I mean, the principles of QCA appeal to me, but I know of rather little research of this kind, relatively little research of this kind that has been done in our field. One of the studies that I do know is actually partly written by Barbara here, and there's another very interesting restudy actually of Robert Wade's, whatever it was, 60-odd villages in Andhra Pradesh, the villages that he studied for his book entitled Village Republics. I'm perhaps particularly susceptible to the claims of that particular piece of research because the findings suggest that Robert perhaps underplayed the significance of the undisputed dominance of a village by a single caste community in that work, and that has always seemed to me to be a possible limitation of it. So there it is. I really do think that there is a great deal to be learnt from the use of relatively conventional research methods. But I do wish that more researchers would be ready to combine methods than I think has been the case in general hitherto.